The President of the United States of America, Donald Trump, decides to exclude the Republic of Cameroon from the list of countries or African countries benefiting from the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, AGOA. President Donald Trump is accusing President Paul Biya's country, notably the government, of gross human rights violations and violations which are contravening to the eligibility requirement of Section 104 of the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act. Donald Trump accuses the government of Cameroon of extrajudicial killings, arbitrary and unlawful detention and torture by Cameroonian soldiers, notably within the context of the deepening socio-political and security crisis in the northwest and southwest regions of the Republic of Cameroon, as a section of the Anglophone community in Cameroon continues pressing for the restoration of the independence of the former Southern Cameroon. We will take a look at the independence option, the independence struggle, how feasible it is. We'll also take a look at perspectives for peace and normalcy in the northwest and southwest regions of the country, and also the expected implementation of recommendations of the major national dialogue in this edition of The Insight. I am Babla Jonathan. Thanks for joining us. Our guest in this edition of the program is a former United Nations Secretary General's representative or deputy representative in the Ivory Coast from 2004 to 2014 to 2016, acting head of the United Nations Human Rights Field Operation in Rwanda, equally former senior policy advisor of the United Nations Development Program, a representative of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights in the Ivory Coast, Director of Political Affairs in the United Nations Stabilization Mission in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Dr. Simon MUNDZU was equally the first spokesperson of the Anglophone General Conference before stepping down following death threats against him. And of course, he was the president of one of the 8 commissions at the major national dialogue which took place in Yaoundé. Dr. Simon MUNDZU, you're welcome.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thanks for having me once again on this program. Thank you.
All right, we're going to start with the United States of America, the decision of Donald Trump to exclude Cameroon from the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act.
Some people will say that it did not come as a surprise because, you see, ever since the conflict in the northwest and southwest regions took a military form, human rights violations have been committed, and those who investigate those violations have repeatedly said that both belligerents, that is to say, the government forces on the one hand and the separatist forces on the other, have been committing serious human rights violations. Now, it would appear that at this particular moment, the government of the United States feels that the level of violations attributable to Cameroonian forces of law and order is of such magnitude as to warrant Cameroon being taken off the list of African countries that enjoy facilities under the AGOA. That's a sovereign decision for the government of the United States. There is no doubt that there will be a reaction from the government of Cameroon. There usually is. And we're all waiting to see how things unfold. But just to put matters in perspective, my understanding is that this measure has been announced. It doesn't take effect until January 2020, if it does take effect.
1st January 2020.
Exactly. So it is possible that between now and then, the President of the United States, as adequately advised, revises the situation. It's possible. It is also possible that the decision will be confirmed and that for an unlimited or unspecified duration, Cameroon may indeed be deprived of the facilities under AGOA.
He said that he was going to continue monitoring happenings in the country with regards to human rights violations after having accused the military of extrajudicial killings, arbitrary and unlawful arrest and detention, and of course torture.
Yes, indeed. I mean, that's the situation. So we are all waiting to see. It is really unfortunate that repeatedly we see this happening, where on the one hand, NGOs and others who monitor the human rights situation on the ground come out with accusations, allegations of violations committed by the forces of law and order in the field, especially against unarmed civilians. But at the same time, for every one of those reports, there usually is a denial issued by the government. You remember the last, I think, was back in April of this year, where the Minister of Information and spokesperson of the government denied the allegations that were brought to the surface at the time. So, and yet there is a sense in the population that there are violations going on. So this accusation and counter-accusation, accusation and denial, we don't know how long it's going to continue that way, but we continue to insist that the best way to put an end to all of this is to put an end to the conflict itself. And we are surprised that it's taking so long for this to happen.
And in the northwest and in the southwest regions of the country, some Anglophones, a section of the Anglophone community, have continued to press for restoration of the independence of the former Southern Cameroons. This is not a problem that started in 2016. This is an issue that has been on the table for decades with the SNC and other organizations that have been pressing for a restoration of the independence of the former Southern Cameroons. And this is what is at the center of all the killings, all the destruction, all the atrocities that have been committed in the two Anglophone regions of the country. How feasible is this independence option?
Well, I mean, Mr. Babila, you will not be hearing from me for the first time on this. I have said since this crisis began that we, the people, if you like, of the former Southern Cameroons, have a solid case for the restoration of the state arrangements by which our two territories, the British Southern Cameroons as it was then, and La République du Cameroun as it was on the eve of unification, agreed to unify on the basis of forming a federation of two equal states, in which the heritage of each of these territories will be fully recognized and be allowed to thrive. Now, that arrangement was honored for 11 years. In 1972, everything was disrupted. Now, and we have seen the consequences between 1972 and 2016, 2018, 2019. Now, we've seen the consequences, which are in fact an erosion of the system that we brought into the Union. Our being increasingly sidelined in the governance of the country when you really examine things properly. The absence of, the noticeable absence of Anglophones in real decision-making institutions, especially those to do with the economy and so on. So now, we had wanted, prior to a national dialogue on the Anglophone problem, to hold an Anglophone General Conference, which was going to be the opportunity for all Anglophones to actually sit down and produce the evidence of what we're talking about when we say that we are marginalized, we are assimilated, and so on, so that nobody should have any doubt about what we're saying. Unfortunately, that preparatory meeting did not take place prior to going to the dialogue in Yaoundé. Now, so for a return to federation, we have a strong case because the independence or the decolonization of our territory was supervised by the UN. So you can go back to the UN and say, you remember that these are the bases on which we agreed to join. Now, against that, one, if you like, group of Cameroonians who in the first were rather feeble but became very vocal since this conflict began, namely the separatists, come up with the theory that there was never a proper union in 1961, that our independence was started but never really completed, so we have to go back now and restore it, etc., etc. What is clear, however, is that these are our brothers and sisters who are peddling this kind of propaganda. They've managed to convince those who listen to them and follow them, but they know that in international law and in diplomacy, they don't have a case. That's the reason why it has never been taken, this conflict has never been, their claim has never been taken to any international organ. When
you say they don't have a case, they don't have a case, what do you mean by that?
By that I mean that, contrary to what they say, in 1961, the United Nations effectively took a decision enshrined in General Assembly Resolution 1608, which they keep quoting. But you see, they quote Resolution 1608, and every time they quote it, they claim that under that resolution, we were supposed to go to Fumban with the presence of the British. They come up with a treaty, a union treaty. The union treaty was never signed, etc., etc. But I would invite your viewers to read Resolution 1608. It says nothing about Cameroonians going to go and come up with a union treaty. The resolution asked the government of Southern Cameroon, the government of the Republic of Cameroon, and the United Kingdom as administering authority to continue their discussions, which they had already engaged before April 1961, following the plebiscite of February 1961, to give effect to the decision of the people of Southern Cameroon to achieve independence by joining La République. This is what 1608 said. And that happened. A series of meetings were held from May right through to August. And the highest point of that was the Fumban Conference. So in a series of meetings, these three parties worked out the terms on which to give effect to the decision of the population of Southern Cameroon to achieve independence by joining La République. And that the result was the Federal Republic of Cameroon, with a constitution, the Constitution of the Federal Republic, which came into effect on the 1st of October 1961. So, for anybody to argue that there was no union, it's giving our people false hope.
But the point is that when I listen to legal minds who master the law, like Barrister Ashu Emmanuel Abo, and he says there is no union treaty. There was never a union treaty. There was never any legal document to show that the two parts, the two states came together as one in a federal system.
There was no need, and I've heard Barrister Ashu and others on that. There was no need for a union treaty. No one insisted that there should be a union treaty. Well, I was trying to look up the text here, but once again, what Resolution 1608, especially paragraph 5, said was to call on these three parties to go and pursue their discussions, their negotiations, to agree on modalities for giving effect to the decision of the people of Southern Cameroon as expressed in the plebiscite of 11 February 1961, namely the decision, their choice to achieve independence by joining La République du Cameroon. And what this UN General Assembly said was that they must make sure that this is concluded in such a way that on the 1st of October 1961, we put an end to the trusteeship agreement between the United Kingdom and the UN. Okay?
But,
and that's exactly what happened. By the 1st of October 1961, the parties had fully agreed on arrangements for how they conduct the affairs of their country, starting from the 1st of October 1961.
But the former Supreme Court Judge of the Republic of Cameroon, Barrister Ayapol Abini, says it was just a declaration of intent. The plebiscite, just a declaration of intent.
No, the plebiscite was not just a declaration of intent. The plebiscite was organized by the United Nations, which wanted to ascertain the wishes of the people of the Northwest and Southwest, as we call it now, the people of the British Southern Cameroons, as to whether they would achieve independence by joining Nigeria or achieve independence by joining La République, given the fact that they were not allowed the choice of independence standing on their own. That's another issue. That's a different matter.
There was no third option.
There was no third option. Now, had the population of the British Southern Cameroons overwhelmingly voted, or majority voted to join Nigeria, we would have been with Nigeria, just as happened with the Northern Cameroons. Okay? So for anybody to say that was just a declaration of intent, no. It was a choice made by the people of British Southern Cameroons. And in Security Council, United Nations General Assembly Resolution 1608, the General Assembly takes note of the results of the plebiscite. Even goes on to congratulate the plebiscite commissioner and his staff. It goes on to note that the people of Southern Cameroons chose freely, and so on and so forth. And it is on the basis of all of that that the General Assembly then said, with respect to Northern Cameroons, we know that Northern Cameroons and Nigeria have already completed their discussions as to what will happen when the trusteeship agreement ends on the 1st of June 1961. And they said, 1st of June 1961, the trusteeship agreement between the United Kingdom and the United Nations over Northern Cameroons will end. And they said, with respect to Southern Cameroons, because the evidence we have is that Mr. Foncha's government, Mr. Hijo's government, and the United Kingdom have not yet finalized the arrangements for giving effect to the choice of the people of British Southern Cameroons, you go and resume your discussions. But make sure that latest 1st of October, everything is completed, so that on the 1st of October 1961, the trusteeship agreement between the United Kingdom, the United Nations, over British Southern Cameroons will end. So no one can, in the light of that, start talking about declaration of intent. No. And I keep saying to Justice Aya and all the other legal luminaries who have been holding this opinion, if that is so, then why don't you take the matter to the United Nations, where you have the Security Council, you have the General Assembly, ultimately you have the International Court of Justice. If you believe that there is a legal case, instead of just talking only to your followers on Facebook, that's not where this matter is going to be resolved. And the reason why they haven't done it is because they know that there's nowhere to take it. There's no way that you are going to get the United Nations to reopen the process of decolonization of the British Southern Cameroons. So the implication for this, Jonathan, for our people and the way people have been suffering is, if independence is not going to be achieved, because for the United Nations, we had already become independent by joining La République, then what are our people dying for?
Some who are standing for this option are quoting the examples of South Sudan, for example, and others who fought and had their independence, even though some of them are really suffering today, like the case of South Sudan.
Well, exactly. Now, that's, again, I have repeatedly said that there are two pathways. For those who are aspiring for the independence of the former British Southern Cameroons, there are two pathways. One is legal and diplomatic, application of international law and diplomacy. That path, as I've just indicated, is closed. Okay? Therefore, if you insist on getting or restoring the independence of this territory, the only other pathway that is open is by armed struggle, by force. And they will tell you that, yes, that is what they're doing now. Okay, but if that is what they're doing now, then, again, I've always said to them, then let the people of that territory know that this is the only way that they're going to get restoration of independence. And just as the examples that you have quoted indicate, that could take 5 years, it could last 15 years, it could last 30 years, it could last 40 years. So, if the people of Southern Cameroons or former Southern Cameroons agree that this is the path they want to go, then nobody will complain about the war and the consequences of war. But you can see from the reaction of our population.
That's a very deadly trap.
Of course, but that's exactly why we don't need to expose our people to that. Where what we ought to be doing is concentrate our energies on pushing what we know is defensible in law and it's feasible by way of negotiation, namely a return to the initial arrangement. Mainly, if you are going to restore something, the thing to restore is the federation.
The federal system.
The federal system. And I believe that, whereas at the beginning of this crisis, the government in Yaoundé was allergic to anything that even smacked of a change, suggested change of the form of the state, including reference to federation, I think everybody can see that over the years, this past 3 years, there has been a movement, a shift towards eventual acceptance of federation. Why? Because in the meantime, people have come to understand better what this is all about, Anglophones and Francophones. And I believe that instead of us continuing down the path of violence, which is taking the lives of our people, regardless of who is doing the killing, any killing is wrong. Any destruction is wrong. Any disruption of the lives of our people is wrong. Any prevention of our children resuming school is wrong, regardless of who is finally responsible for it. Now, why should we continue down that path when we know that it is not going to yield independence, except at an exorbitant cost, which will spread over the next 10 years, 15 years, 30 years? That's the question that we have for the separatists.
Independence option. It's not feasible. Is that what you're saying?
It's not feasible. In law and in diplomacy, it is not attainable. If it ever is to be attained, it can only be attained through war. And no one can determine the duration of that war. It is more likely that it will be long than short. And with the ensuing costs and consequences, a taste of which we've had now for just about 18 months. Because don't forget that the conflict that has just concluded its third year did not start as an armed conflict. So for the first year and a half, there wasn't a loss of lives and all of that. But the last year and a half, we've seen. So if in 1.5 years, we see the devastating consequences and we all say that this is unacceptable, why should we deliberately and blindly run the risk of this going on for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years? Because remember, the government and population of La République du Cameroun, I dare guess, and I would also guess that a good majority of the people of the northern and southwest regions as well, so former British Southern Cameroons, are likely to say, no, we don't want to fight a war of independence. First of all, the others will say, well, we can't let you go. And the Anglophones will say, we don't need to fight a war of independence. All what we want is to get back to our initial arrangement, which is the country remains one, but run on the basis that we have two systems. So one nation, two systems. This is negotiable. This can be discussed. And I would suggest that some kind of beginning, we had a kind of beginning towards this. at the recently concluded
Major
national dialogue.
All right, Doctor, we're going to take a look at what the newspapers reported this week, and when we come back, we'll take a look at recommendations of the major national dialogue, notably the major one, the special status for the northwest and southwest regions of Cameroon. Stay with us.
The Post-Weekender reports that a gun battle between the military and Ambazonian fighters left a student of the University of Bamenda dead and several others injured. The Guardian Post reports the United States President Donald Trump's intention to exclude Cameroon from the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act January 1st, 2020. Even Black Sunday Mboya as Mekima dies abruptly. The death of Ekema Patrick in Douala is qualified by the advocate as sunset in the southwest regional capital, while the Guardian Post reveals that the nation was grieved by shock following the sudden death of Ekema Patrick Esunge, as reported by the Post and the Median. The Sun questions who will succeed Ekema as interim mayor. The question of the Sun was later answered following the appointment of Dr. Efunde John Lyonga as interim mayor of the Boya Council. The Guardian Post orders the disbursement of 200 million francs CFA to Bafoussam landslide victims. Another edition of the Guardian Post reports the fierce battles among the Cameroon People's Democratic Movement, Social Democratic Front, and the Cameroon Renaissance Movement political parties ahead of upcoming municipal and legislative elections. The Star reveals how Atangana Kuna, former Minister of Water and Energy, looted the state.
You're welcome back. Dr. Simon MUNDZU, before the major national dialogue, you were the first spokesperson of the Anglophone General Conference, and you later stepped down following threats, death threats. What happened?
Well, I mean, first of all, as you're aware, and you've just reminded us, yes, I was the first spokesperson of the Anglophone General Conference, designated as such by the conveners. And that was not an accident. I think most people know that even in terms of prior to getting the four church leaders together, Archbishop, the Cardinal Christian Tumi, the moderator of the PCC, the Imam of Boya and the Imam of Bamenda, it took a lot of going between them to get them to come together to agree to convene the AGC, and I did play a role in that. And therefore, it was not an accident that...
and it was also in line with your experience?
Absolutely.
At the level of international diplomacy.
Because I always maintained that, and that comes exactly from having observed what happens elsewhere in these conflict situations. The conflict, you end up sitting around a dialogue table. So I was convinced that there will be a point where there has to be a national dialogue on the Anglophone problem. But I was also convinced that in order for Anglophones to prepare for it properly, they need to sit on among themselves first. Hence the proposal to have a preparatory conference, which we later on called the Anglophone General Conference. Now, I took upon myself, I heeded to the call to coordinate the preparation for this conference, and it was going very well until I started receiving those death threats from separatists. Obviously, one couldn't take those threats lightly in view of what we know to have happened to other people, because when you have a situation where individuals go into a church, like it happened in Ekondo Titi, the Baptist church service going on there, and they go into church and take out a notable like the the late Chief Esau Ito, God bless his soul, from church and go and kill him. Now, when threats come from people like that, you will be an idiot not to take them seriously.
What was the problem with Dr. Simon Munzdzu?
Well, I can only assume that Dr. Simon Munzdzu made it clear right from the beginning that he did not favor the push for independence because of its impracticability for the reasons I've just given you. Okay? And I used to tell, I remember in an interview with Chris Anu in the earlier part of the conflict, in one of the answers to Chris, I told Chris, I said, listen, if someone were to come and offer us, the people of the Northwest and Southwest, independence today and take it, I'm sure we would all want to take it. But it's not as easy as that. That's not how it would happen. Therefore, we've got to be realistic. And measuring the possibilities, I think that the strive for independence is it's a misadventure. So we don't need to waste people's lives and fortunes and all of that for it. I push for federation because it is achievable. Now, obviously, I mean, you would expect the others to treat this simply as a matter of difference of opinion. Okay, I analyze the same situation, I come to one conclusion, and my choice is determined accordingly. You analyze the same situation, you come to your own conclusion, and you make your choice accordingly. We've made our two choices. Why should one person want to kill the other because they have made a choice? So I didn't understand that at all, because other than that, I don't see anything else that I did to deserve.
The national chairman of the Social Democratic Front, John Fundi, and other leaders of the party have been standing and speaking openly that saying that the only option or the best option for now is the federal system, return to the federal system. But they were not threatened. John Fundi was not threatened until recently when he was abducted twice.
Well, you say until recently. You say until recently. I put even the threat to me, I put it in context. I have never said that it is against me alone that threats were made, because I mean, John Fundi, the last two kidnappings were the most recent manifestation of a phenomenon that has lasted much longer. Barrister Agbobala has been the object of threats, including at one point when people went into their village home and caused damage there, and so on and so forth. So in turn, the truth of the matter is that in turn, outspoken people who have taken a stand in favor of our struggle, that short of independence, have been the object of these attacks, manifestations of various kinds. But I think that in my specific case, it had to do with the fact that we were indeed moving to something very definite and very concrete, which was what? Which was the convening of a preparatory conference of Anglophones. To do what? To prepare the ground for engaging with the government of Yaoundé on a national dialogue on the Anglophone problem. Now, somehow, in the leadership of the separatists, they didn't want this to happen, and so they tried to stop it. And I would say that in a way they succeeded, because on the one hand, their threat that the AGC cannot be allowed to hold, as they put it, anywhere in amber land, was one obstacle we had to cross. The other, of course, was the attitude of the government as well. But it has to be said that up to this point, the government never actually came out clearly saying, yes, this conference can go on, or no, this conference cannot go on. They played dumb, as it were. But the most immediate reason for the conference not taking place was the fact that our friends, brothers, amongst separatists had said this conference cannot hold anywhere in amber land.
And among those who also said, apart from separatists, among those who also said this conference cannot hold here
was the mayor of Boya,
who is no more.
Yeah,
what do you remember of the mayor of Buea and Jos?
Well, I have to say that, first of all, I mean, I have a very profound sense of regret that he has passed and passed in these circumstances. But in terms of his interacting with him, I never actually had the opportunity to interact with him, except what I watched, heard him say on television or read about him in the media and so on.
He's a fervent anti-ghost town crusader.
Absolutely. I mean, we have always said that, unfortunately, we, the population of the Northwest and Southwest, have been held captive by two extremes. And I would say that the late Patrick Ekema represented the extreme on what you may call the pro-unitarist camp, which I see as a camp that would want to perpetuate assimilation of the people and territory of the former British Southern Cameroons. So there is that extreme. And then the other extreme is the separatists. And we were caught, we've been caught between the two all these years, especially these past 3 years.
The Anglophone General Conference never took place, but there was a national dialogue that took place with the perspectives of peace and a return to normalcy in the Northwest and Southwest regions of the country. And you were leading one of the commissions that was initially supposed to be led by Dr. Christopher Fomunyo, but because of his absence, you had to lead that commission. I think the Commission on Reconstruction and Development of the affected areas in the Northwest and Southwest
and the far north
of the country.
And the far north.
Right. What emerged from that commission?
Well, I mean, the commission did work. I mean, we did some rather thorough work, I would say, in terms of assessing the needs in the three affected regions, Northwest, Southwest, but also far north. We conducted an assessment of how much damage had been sustained in terms of destruction of economic infrastructure, destruction of communication infrastructure, the destruction of schools and medical centers and other social welfare infrastructure and so on. In other words, a thorough, full analysis of the amount of damage sustained by the population in these three regions. We recommended that there has to be a special program for recovery and development in those three regions, and that it will require identifying three types of interventions. The first category were things that needed to be done and done immediately and quickly to enable people to return to their homes and resume the normal life. And that included rebuilding homes where they have been destroyed, rebuilding schools where they have been destroyed, rehabilitating medical services where they have been vandalized or destroyed. In some instances, we were told that bridges between certain villages or between the rural and urban and semi-urban centers had been destroyed, making it impossible for people to move around and conduct economic business affairs normally. Those were to be rehabilitated, etc. So there's a range of interventions that have the capacity of producing an impact immediately. So quick impact projects. And then there was the second category was more medium term, and in that category we included things like the building of council roads in a specific council area, linking localities in that council area. And then the third category, more of a development nature, were projects such as resumption of work on the construction of the ring road in the northwest, the deep sea port in Limbe, and so on. And all these were identified, classified, and are to form the nucleus for the development of a comprehensive a special reconstruction program for those 3 regions.
But all of that can only be done, especially in the 2 Anglophone regions, after the return of peace and normalcy.
Yes.
And one of the major outcomes of the national dialogue, which is intended to restore peace and normalcy in those 2 regions for reconstruction to be done, is the special status for the northwest and southwest regions of this country. What do you think about this special status? Is it what you went for?
Well, as I said earlier, and as I indicated in the keynote address that I delivered at the dialogue, because apart from acting as chairperson of the commission that you mentioned, I did also deliver one of those who delivered keynote addresses at the dialogue. I did state on that occasion that I am a federalist, and I think most people know that I'm a federalist. Therefore, in going to the my preferred outcome of the dialogue would have been a definitive commitment for a return to the federal system of government, because I believe that in this country, regardless of what number of states we eventually have and all of that, regions and so on, we are going to, because of the nature of our country, we have to accept that what we need is a system that can be summed up in terms of 1 nation, 2 systems.
Or 2 states.
It doesn't have to be 2 states, 2 systems. In other words, if you have a 2-state federation, 1 Anglophone, 1 Francophone, okay, you have 1 nation, and you're going to have 2 states and two systems, because the Francophone system applies in one and the Anglophone system in the other. If you say you have a 10-state federation, taking into account the aspirations of each of our regions, the people of each of our regions for autonomy, if you ended up with a 10-state federation, then again the Anglophone states in that federation would run their affairs following the system inherited by the former British or the Southern Cameroons. So whatever number of states you have, this country needs, for purposes that we all know, for the reasons that we all know, to be run on the idea of 1 nation, 2 systems. So that is what one would have liked to have come out of the dialogue. What we got is short of that. Nevertheless, I left that dialogue with a comfortable feeling for 2 reasons. One, for the first time, we had all Cameroonians of all walks of life, all persuasions, admitting that there is an Anglophone problem. Because one of the hardest things, one of the things that have made it so difficult for this problem to be resolved, was the denial by those who are supposed to be leading us in the search for a solution of the existence of the Anglophone problem. Now, so there was that.
Even though prior to that, some interpreted what the president said concerning marginalization as a refusal of the
well, indeed.
When he said that the appointment of ministers,
yes,
prime ministers from the 2 Anglophone regions, is a sign that
yes,
there's no marginalization.
Yes, indeed. I mean, there's no doubt that even up to the eve of the dialogue, there are people who are still denying. But one of the achievements of the dialogue was that indeed, as a result of the discussions carried on in that context, finally it was admitted that there is an Anglophone problem. If there isn't an Anglophone problem, you wouldn't be trying to solve it by, amongst other things, a proposal for special status. But now, having said that, what does the special status mean? We are all still waiting to see what content this will be given. Because don't forget that the only thing that Article 62, paragraph 2 of the Constitution says, which is the one that it simply says that the law may take into consideration the specificities of certain regions with regard to their organization and functioning.
But some have already said this special status that came out of the national dialogue for the Northwest and the Southwest regions is more or less useless, not going to change anything at all.
No, that's an unduly pessimistic interpretation, because precisely what came out? Nothing came out. All what the major national dialogue did was to recommend that the head of state should have recourse to Article 62(2), which I've just read to you. In other words, he should, through law, consider the specificities of the Northwest and Southwest regions with regard to their organization and functioning.
Can the special status solve any problem in the Northwest and Southwest?
If given proper content, because what is the problem of Northwest and Southwest in terms of within the parameters that we're discussing? It is the main grievance is what? The main grievance is that the Northwest and Southwest regions have had their system of governance, they're seeing it disappear as they continue to be absorbed, assimilated, dominated, okay, through the governance practices of the past, especially the past 20 to 30 years, all right? So that is what you need to put an end to. So how do you put an end to it? You put an end to it, for example, by saying that these two regions constitute a special entity where, for example, you would have maybe a prime minister or whatever other name we want to give to someone who is at the head of that entity, where you say that that entity can now resume the administration of justice following the common law, which is, if you like, is the foundation for justice in that part, in that territory, where you say they can now run the education system from basic education to tertiary education, following the system of education that people refer to as the Anglo-Saxon system of education, as you'll find in Ghana, in Nigeria, in Kenya, and so on. Right, so, and those are only examples. Now, if
Social Democratic Front talked of the example of Quebec.
Absolutely. So if by saying, if the content you give to taking into consideration the specificities of these two regions with regard to their organization and functioning leads you to all what we're saying about and produces a system that is indeed comparable to that of Quebec in Canada, and there are other examples that one can cite, yeah, then the main grievance of the people of Northern and Southwest would have been taken care of.
Doctor, we're going to take some interviews now.
With the active collaboration of administrative authorities and officials of the defense and security forces in your area of command, we shall spare no efforts to sensitize and build confidence with the local population in order to reassure and bring them.
We have to work hard to guarantee the security of people on their property. And as far as I'm concerned, I've came here like a champion of peace. And all the elite and population of Kupe Maneguba must be champions of peace, because without peace, nothing can be done.
Another major problem is the roads, our roads. You know, everybody is an eyewitness. Our roads are completely neglected. Melon Bangem Road, where construction work started, Tarin started, ended in Mangel, that is not even part of Kupe Maneguba. So far, we don't have any patch of tar on our road.
The first challenge of the new divisional officer is mainly the challenge of security. He should ensure the security of the people of the subdivision and their properties. Also, the integrity of the state. Also, this motorbike. Most of the crimes are committed through the motorbike. That sector also needs a small reform, a big reform even.
We decided to dispatch our envoys to the local government areas of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, neighboring Donga Mantum. They went to and met the chairman, the honorable chairman of the Taraba local government area, that of Kumi government, local government area, Takum local government area, and OSA also, and they came with valuable information. I have already written to them. We are collaborating to stamp out at all costs this cattle theft that has become a canker worm at our borders.
This is a high-level interministerial mission which has been sent by the Prime Minister, head of government, for an evaluation meeting. That is, we have to extensively evaluate what is going on. And you hear Minister Yebe Aisi, he said that prevention, he has insisted on prevention. Yes, it is very, very important because, as you can see, this is a landslide, and this area is a very swampy area, meaning that under normal circumstances, people should not build here. And that's why Madam Minister Kechakuche is insisting that people should respect the preliminary instructions, elementary instructions on how to carry out buildings. And you want to have a property, but it should be done normally. Yes. So I think that it is a very, very sad situation.
The major national dialogue has come and gone. Weeks have passed. The President of the Republic went to France, gave an account of the national dialogue to the French President Emmanuel Macron, came back home, and there is some sort of a dead silence. The recommendations are on his table. Nothing has been said till now. Why?
Well, I wouldn't be in a position to answer why. I'm not in government, I'm not in the president's cabinet, but I think that many people during the dialogue did at least I know that in my own committee we did repeatedly draw attention, and I think it was even the general resolution as well, the final report, attention to the fact that the outcome of the dialogue needed to be implemented, and implemented quickly. That it would be it would be undesirable for the government to proceed as if it was business as usual. So I can only hope that the president is sufficiently aware of the need to proceed on this with great speed, because the end of the crisis depends on this. And if the crisis doesn't end, then all those negative consequences that we have been decrying for these past 3 years and did with insistence at the dialogue would continue. And I would be very surprised to think that the President of the Republic, having convened the dialogue, knowing the urgency of the situation and the necessity to put an end to the negative consequences of the conflict, would go to sleep on the recommendations. So is it that since the conclusion of the dialogue, he is set up a structure to examine the outcome and make proposals to him, or what? I am not privy to anything, so I will not prejudge that. But I would say, number one, that it would be regrettable if there wasn't a common sense of urgency and the need to do this, to handle this in the circles of the government. But on the other hand, I am not so sure that the perception that everyone has gone to sleep on the outcome of the dialogue is true, because we know the way our system functions. Not everything is transparent. So I would like to think that while you and I, as observers and citizens, are waiting to see signs that things are actually happening, the ground is being laid for things to happen. Because if it weren't the case, it would be really, really unfortunate for this country.
Barrister Agbo Bala, one of the participants at the major national dialogue, said for the special status to be implemented, the constitution has to be amended. What do you expect from the members of parliament, the lawmakers, in the upcoming November session of parliament?
Well, it's not so much an expectation from the members of parliament as from the government, because, you know, I mean, it is the government that would have to table a bill before parliament to reform the constitution, because indeed to give effect to this concept of special status along the lines that we were discussing earlier would require a constitutional amendment. But the bill to amend the constitution would not come from parliamentarians. It will come from the government, which will table it before parliament. So since parliament it's supposed to be convening this month of November, although we know that it's a budget session, so in principle the budget session is not supposed to handle any other kind of business, but nothing stops the establishment once the budget session ends to immediately convene an extraordinary session to look at whatever new proposals for reform of the constitution the government would want to put forth in order to give effect to the recommendation to raise the Northwest and Southwest to special status.
The government tables the bill, but the parliamentarians, they are the lawmakers.
Yes.
And they will decide to validate the content of the bill that has been tabled or ask for amendment.
Of course, it is the role of parliamentarians to examine every bill that comes before them.
Most often, all the bills that comes from government simply goes through, despite the content, whether it is acceptable, whether it is going to produce the required benefits for the people on the ground, for the citizens. It simply goes through, despite opposition from MPs from the Social Democratic Front, for example. The bill finally goes through.
Yeah.
What will you say to the MPs of the CPDM with regards to the content of a bill that may eventually be tabled on the special status?
I mean, it's difficult to give advice and make recommendations to the members of parliament of the CPDM in this context, for the simple reason that from what we know in the way they function, by virtue of the so-called party discipline, we have never known CPDM MPs to step out of the line. Every now and again you may have a rare example. I think Justice Aya Paul did when he was CPDM member of parliament in those days. Other than that, I mean, we know that the so-called party discipline constrains parliamentarians from introducing any radical proposals for amendment to a bill received from the government. However, in this particular instance, we would want to count on the sense of responsibility of each parliamentarian, whether of government or of the opposition, to recognize that in order to solve this problem, we do actually need this special status phenomenon to be implemented, and to be implemented meaningfully, to the point where it makes a difference sufficiently for people to say, okay, this serves as a good basis for ending the crisis and for normalcy to return to the north and the southwest. So it's a matter of appealing to the individual sense of responsibility of these MPs. Otherwise, I have no other advice to give because of the way the system functions.
Thanks, Dr. Simon MUNDZU. You are the former United Nations Secretary General's Deputy Representative in Ivory Coast.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks, ladies and gentlemen, for staying with us. That's it for today.